Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News. Today is Sunday, September 22nd, 2024. Sunday, September 22nd, 2024. And our first story is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories and is titled The Meditation Myth. A new study finds that many of the benefits related to meditating turn out to be false. It was found that it does not make a person calmer or more compassionate, and just as aggressive or prejudiced if this was in their nature to begin with. The 14th Dalai Lama once claimed, if every 8-year-old in the world is taught meditation, the world will be without violence within one generation. However, it appears he's wrong, since a study has found this trendy Buddhist practice doesn't change how adults behave towards each other. Since the 1970s, the powers of meditation became very popular in the Western world. The Transcendental Meditation movement focuses on the mental repetition of a Sanskrit short word. It was defined as a non-religious technique of paying attention to the present moment. During the 1970s, researchers published studies that concluded it decreased aggression and violence at a societal level. The appeal to this idea is obvious, since it's not only a way to change a person, but society as well. Dr. Miguel Farias, co-author of the study, said, quote, "All world religions promised the world would change for the better if only people were to follow its rules and practices. The popularization of meditation techniques in a secular format is offering the hope of a better self and a better world to many. In the early 1970s, Transcendental Meditation conveyed this message openly, announcing that the rising number of individuals practicing this technique would lead to world peace in the short term. Psychologists using mindfulness or other Buddhism-derived meditation techniques are now advancing similar ideas about the pro-social effects of meditation. The popularization of meditation techniques like mindfulness, despite being taught without religious beliefs, still seems to offer the hope of a better self and a better world to many." End quote. More than 20 studies were investigated where meditators were compared to persons who did not meditate. Overall, there was a positive impact where people felt more empathetic and compassionate. However, further analysis found meditation didn't reduce aggression or prejudice. There was an unexpected finding, with the results citing positive outcomes of compassion had methodological flaws. Only if the meditation teacher was also an author of the report did the compassion levels increase, which indicates biases in the findings. Bottom line, even scientists will lie to justify their own personal beliefs on a subject. Quote, "The media portrayal of meditation as a cure for a range of mental health problems or to improve well-being is very likely to feed back into participants who will have a high expectation of the benefits of a meditation intervention." End quote. There is a less positive side to meditation, which is demonstrated when some people described problems sleeping or re-experiencing traumatic events from their past. There has been very little examination of negative experiences. In 2020, of 7,000 studies on mindfulness, only 1% investigated the downside of this practice. According to Willoughby Britton, PhD, a professor at Brown University, quote, "People don't want to tell you that they were harmed by your treatment. They'd rather lie, and the therapist doesn't want to hear it. The researcher doesn't want to hear it. Pretty much no one wants to talk about it." End quote. It was found that 6% who reported negative side effects meditated more. There has been documentation in Buddhist textual sources that are described of hundreds of years old, which also described adverse effects. Some of the downsides reported from meditations are anxiety, attacks, increased disassociation with the world, lack of motivation, and sleep problems. Physical symptoms are pain, pressure, involuntary movements, headaches, fatigue, weakness, gastrointestinal problems, and dizziness. A 1992 study conducted by Dean H. Shapiro, Jr., Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Psychiatry and Human Behavior at the School of Medicine at the University of California, Irvine, found that participants were more aware of their negative qualities after returning from a meditation retreat. A study from 1979 found there was a precipitation of acute psychosis brought on by intensive meditation for persons with a history of schizophrenia. There's also another aspect to meditation as described in this entry. I have been a Vipassana meditator since 2001 and had a very strong practice and very good concentration. Last 2 to 3 years, I started feeling a physical violation of space and then hearing voices. What interacts with me is some kind of demon or demons that have started harming me with negative gross vibrations of all kinds and use very harmful language. They also harm physically and hurt around the spine and different organs of the body and the nervous system to get your energy, some kind of energy vampires. They harm continuously and never stop. It is impossible to meditate or do anything else. They seem to know how to connect to human mind and body and somehow gain control over the nervous system. I asked a lot of people for help, including meditators, even teachers, but so far haven't found anyone who knows about this or wants to help. I don't even know where to get the help. No drugs or medicines have helped so far. Even tried to get some mantra tantra help. I have also read and listened to Ratana and Atantiya Sutta, written to monasteries. I cannot give metta or practice vipassana at all because I am constantly under attack. I am not delusional, and these are not illusions. End quote. British scholar Os Guinness states, quote, many who practice yoga or Zen meditation have found they have opened their minds to blackness and spiritism, seeing themselves as mediums and describing themselves as possessed. End quote. And I thought this was very interesting because, you always think of meditation as being very wholesome or things along those lines. And like all things, I don't know if it's maybe people that meditate too much or maybe some people just aren't suited to it. But yeah, something interesting as far as, like they said, they only report on certain things which are the positive side of meditation and not the downside for some people. The following out of Stranger Than Fiction stories is titled Superstitions from Yesteryear. Superstition is defined as a belief, not based on human reason or scientific knowledge, that future events may be influenced by one's behavior in some magical or mystical way. The following are some of the superstitions. I was surprised when I read some of these. Dream of eggs, sign of money. Dream of snakes, sign of enemies. If you sing before breakfast, you'll cry before supper. Dreaming of muddy or rushing water brings trouble. Finding a horseshoe or a four-leafed clover brings good luck. If you cut your nails or sneeze on Saturday, you do it for evil. I don't know how to take that one. Okay. She who takes the last stitch at a quilting will be the first to marry. If you cannot make up a handsome bed, your husband will have a homely nose. Okay. If you spill the salt, someone will be mad with you unless you put some in the fire. Stub your right toe, you are going where you are wanted. Your left, where you are not wanted. If the rooster crows on the fence, the weather will be fair. If on the doorstep, he will bring company. In the first Sunday in the month if the first Sunday in the month is unpleasant, there will be but one pleasant Sunday during the month. If by any chance a mourning hat or bonnet is placed upon your head, you will need one of your own soon. Okay. If your right ear burns, someone is praising you. If your left, your friends are raking you over the coals. Returning to the house for a moment after having once started out will bring bad luck unless you sit down. When in dropping a fork it strikes the floor and stands upright, it will bring a gentleman visitor. If a knife, a lady. While at the washboard, if the suds splash and wet the clothes you are wearing, you will have a drunken husband. Oh boy. If you drop your dishcloth, you will have company. Also, if you sweep a black mark, or if two chairs stand accidentally back to back. If a baby sees his face in the glass, it will be the death of him. If his nails are cut, he will be a thief. If he tumbles out of bed, it will save his being a fool. It's going to be babies with long nails. Break a mirror, sign of death. Death is also foretold by a dog howling under a window, hearing a mourning dove, a strange dove hovering about, or dreaming of a white horse. If you see the new moon through the glass, you will have sorrow as long as it lasts. If you see it fair in the face, you will have a fall. Over the left shoulder, bad luck. Over the right, good luck. Interesting, huh? Very interesting. I know some of them have lived on a little bit like the ringing in the ear stuff, but all right. Okay, then next story is, let's see, out of LAD Bible or Lad Bible, and it's titled "Mystery of Deformed Body Found in Lead Coffin Under Notre Dame That Baffled Scientists for Years Finally Solved." Reconstruction work on Notre Dame following the fire that seriously damaged the iconic cathedral uncovered some parts of the structure that would have otherwise been left alone. In 2022, 2 lead-lined coffins were found to have been buried beneath the nave of Notre Dame, and experts set about identifying who the 2 occupants were. Thanks to a brass plaque on one of the coffins, one of the bodies was soon identified as belonging to Antoine de la Porte, the canon of Notre Dame, who died on Christmas Eve 1710 at the ripe old age of 83. All things considered, he had good innings, as the French would say, if they'd ever shown a little more care for cricket and much less for their own language. Experts noted that his skeleton indicated he lived a largely sedentary life and had very good teeth. The mystery skeleton in the next coffin over was quite the opposite. While de la Porte had died old and with good teeth after a sedentary life, the other body had died young with terrible teeth and appeared to have a penchant for horse riding. That body was nicknamed Le Cavalier, as his pelvic bones suggested he was an experienced rider. He seemed to have died in his 30s and suffered from a chronic disease that destroyed most of his teeth by the time he was dead. Apparently, the end of this chap's life was not pleasant or easy one, but now we know who he is. The mystery of the skeleton's identity has been solved, as he's the French poet Joachim du Bellay, who died in his late 30s on January 1st, 1560. During his life, he had spent some time working at Notre Dame and was recorded as having been buried there, but his tomb had never been found. His body showed traces of bone tuberculosis in the neck and head, as well as chronic meningitis, conditions mentioned in some of the poet's work. He also had a deformation of the skull, which would have been caused by wearing a headband as a baby. The adeptness of riding a horse would make sense, as well as he did ride from Paris to Rome and spend a few years living there, where he got the hots for a local lady called Faustine. It's suspected that his tomb was moved at some point after he was buried, as there had been previous efforts to locate the poet's final resting place, which failed because he wasn't where records indicated he was buried. Notre Dame is scheduled to reopen on December the 8th. And as you remember, there was a fire, which I think was I don't know. They were saying it was not that it was not arson, but I think it was. It was under not construction. They were fixing things, and it's a very old structure. All of a sudden, poof, and I have a feeling that there was that was not like bad luck. How's that? Okay, going back to Stranger Than Fiction stories. Next story is titled "Conquistadors Sacrificed and Cannibalized in Aztec-Era Mexico." A year after Hernando Cortez conquered Mexico, the Acuajas, I don't know how to pronounce it right, part of the Aztec Empire, ambushed a Spanish convoy, killing and eating the captives. In 2015, archaeologists spoke of a discovery unearthed in 1992 near Mexico City, providing proof that conquistadors, women, children, and animals were held captives and eventually sacrificed and eaten by Mexican natives known as Texococanos or Aguajas. The excavations at the site were done between 1992 and 2010. The event was chronicled by Cortes in his Cartas de Relación, aka related letters, but this discovery confirms that within only a few miles from the aid of the Spanish army, the group was captured. Sent from Cuba, the convoy included 15 Spaniards, 45 soldiers, 50 women, 10 children, and 350 indigenous allies. Among them was a contingent of Afro-Caribbeans, Taino Indians, and mulattoes. The number has been estimated to be as high as 550, and the Alcojas decimated them from June 1520 to March 1521. They rebuilt Tenochtitlan east of the capital to hold the prisoners for the 6 months of their imprisonment. An archaeologist at the site said the priest would choose a victim every few days and kill them in the town square, where their companions could hear their screams. Like cattle, they were fattened while alive. They were sacrificed to the snake-like fertility god Quetzalcoatl, the jaguar god Texlapoca, and Huitzilopochtli, the warrior god. Each one would be satiated with different sacrifices. For example, rain deities preferred children. It might be said they were given over to appease gods, but there is no denying there was sadism underlying the priest action. 15,000 artifacts were found, including figurines with European-looking garb. The archaeologists said, "We have figurines of blacks and of Europeans that were then intentionally decapitated." Another small sculpture, resembling something not quite human, and instead it has an angel's face on one side and a demon with goat horns on the other, was found. The captive skeletons showed cuts where they were defleshed, and the horses as well. There were evidence they were torn apart. The meat was consumed by the Alcojas. Other bones were made into a rack, which Cortes found later when he arrived to avenge the savage act. Another instance of their disturbing behavior was when the pelvis of a sacrificed woman who had been dismembered in the plaza had the skull of a 1-year-old child placed within it. Ironically, the pigs were spared a public execution since they had never been seen by the natives. The archaeologists said they were sacrificed and hidden in a well, but there is no evidence they were cooked. They were whole and uneaten. When Cortes arrived with soldiers, the Alcojas attempted to hide evidence of what they had done to the captives. The effort helped to preserve them until they were unearthed. They tossed the belongings of the victims into rooms and cisterns. More than 200 objects were recovered in 13 cisterns, which measured about 4 feet in diameter. Among them was a riding spur, a brooch, rings, iron nails, and ceramic figurines. Also found was a throne made from volcanic rock and a cylindrical stone carved with the image of the Aztec god Omechontli, known as Two Rabbit, which was associated with pulque and drunkenness. It was represented by a rabbit. Pulque, an alcoholic beverage made from the fermented sap of the maguey plant, was produced in large quantities at Seputepec, Tecocaque. One of the cisterns also contained pulque carafes and the cooked vertebrae and ribs of at least 3 different infants. The Alcojas abandoned the town and the Spanish troops razed it. Afterwards, it was renamed to Tecoaque, which translates to the place where they ate them. When Captain Gonzalo de Sandoval arrived at Sutepec with 15 horsemen and 200 soldiers, the terrible fate of the caravan became known. On a wall he read where someone wrote in charcoal, "Here the unlucky Juan Yuste was held prisoner." His description continued, quote, "In this town much blood was spilled from the Spaniards killed there. Walls were spattered with it, as were their idols. There were 2 skinned faces, and their skins were tanned as if to make gloves of them. Their beards were still attached and offered on one of their altars. Also found were the skins of horses that were cured. They still had the hair, hoofs, and tails. They were also offered to their idols. The clothing these dead Spaniards had worn were offered to these same idols." End quote. Ironically, the Aztecs believed Hernan Cortes was the god Quetzalcoatl, and his accompanying conquistadors were gods as well. The impact of the Spaniards on the Aztec or Nahuatl people was chronicled by a Franciscan friar, Bernardino de San Juan, who created the Florentine Codex he started in 1545. He added to it until his death in 1590. It included 2,400 pages and more than 2,000 images. By the time Cortez arrived in Mexico, the Aztecs had come to rule over 500 small states and some 5 to 6 million people. The Aztecs were conquered due to a combination of reasons. One of them was their belief the conquerors were gods and ignorant of the weapons they used. Also, they were oppressive rulers who were resented by local groups for the high tributes they exacted. Many of the other natives joined forces with the Spaniards. Part of the tributes exacted by the Aztecs were victims who were flayed, burned, and had their hearts extracted while alive. Those who joined the Spanish might have had misgivings about the tall, fair strangers, but no doubt they were searching for a way to end the torment of being put to death so savagely in a culture of death and violence that claimed victims daily. Existence as scapegoats used to appease always hungry gods must have been difficult. Life was not tranquil before the arrival of the conquistadors. The Spanish priest who accompanied Cortez on his conquest described how prisoners captured by the Aztecs on some occasions were forced to dance during a ritual before they were later decapitated and dismembered. The Spaniards were not saints, but within 10 years of their conquest, human sacrifice had ended. One could admire the artwork the Aztecs produced with eagles, snakes, and gods, but it's hard to overlook when they adorned altars where humans were sacrificed. However, the gods did continue to receive their tribute when many natives died from smallpox brought from Europe and the effects of colonization. Ironically, by the time the Spanish laid siege on the Aztec capital, the Aquajas were allies of Spain. In 1521, the empire fell to the conquistadors. The Aztec culture would eventually be wiped out, and all the sacrifices made to avoid drought, pestilence, and defeat proved insufficient. So there you go. Yeah, you start taking people and using them for sacrifice, and that creates resentment for sure. Okay, next story, also out of Strange and Fiction Stories, is the most haunted Eastern State Penitentiary. Eastern State Penitentiary was established in 1829 on the outskirts of Philadelphia as the model for penitentiaries worldwide. It now sits surrounded by homes and small businesses, crumbling slowly, a silent witness to human history, both inside its echoing hallways and outside its walls as well. Eastern State Penitentiary was built in 1829 of gray granite on 10 acres of elevated land outside Philadelphia on what was known as Cherry Hill. Built in a Quaker-inspired style to emphasize rehabilitation instead of punishment, the designers believed that if subjected to solitude and reflection, criminals could become penitent, and then this in turn would lead to rehabilitation. The term of penitentiary houses dates back to 1788, when mention is made of reforming prisoners by the punishments of solitude, silence, and labor so that they would become useful. Each cell had a vaulted ceiling, and it was fireproof, and was meant to house only one prisoner. Inmates were served through feed holes in the masonry. The doors weren't added until the 1850s. Outside each cell, the prisoner had his own area for exercising, but the walls were so high it did not permit communication with other prisoners. They spent 23 hours in their cell and only 2 30-minute breaks outside. Individual cells had running water with a flush toilet, and central heating was provided during the winter months. Each cell had a skylight to represent the ever-seeing eye of God. They were allowed to garden and keep pets. However, once the prisoner left his cell, a guard would wrap a hood over his head to prevent identification by the other inmates. The capacity of its original design was for 500 prisoners. By 1833, of the 97 prisoners, 4 were women convicted of killing other women. 12 years later, the number of prisoners had risen to 340. By 1870, the number was 600. Women were housed in cell block 2, and in 1923 was the last year they were kept at the prison. In 1832, William Hamilton, number 94, who served as the warden's waiter, was the first escapee from the prison. He lowered himself from the roof of the front building. He was recaptured but escaped in the same manner in 1837. In 1858, over 10,000 tourists from across the world visited Eastern State Penitentiary. Many were impressed with its design. However, Charles Dickens, who toured it in 1842, wrote, quote, "The system is rigid, strict, and hopeless solitary confinement, and I believe it in its effects to be cruel and wrong. End quote. In 1876, the idea of solitary confinement had gone out the window, since there were 3 prisoners to a cell due to overcrowded conditions. In 1877, the population housed at Eastern State Pen was 1,006. In 1929, it was 2,199. In 1897, an investigation was made into allegations of brutal treatment of the prisoners. It was found that some were burned, bruised, and battered, and in most cases they were insane. All the prison officials denied the charges. Throughout the years, reports leaked out of punishments meted out in the form of water baths, where inmates were hung from a wall overnight in the winter after being dunked in water, a chair which bound them tightly by hand and foot, an iron gag which shackled the prisoner's wrists to his tongue, and the Klondike, a cavern-like hole dug out in cell 14 where prisoners were starved. In 1911, Frank Brubaker, an inmate at Eastern State, was found to be insane. He had been convicted of shooting a man in the head in 1904 with a Winchester rifle, which he brought with him when he turned himself in at the mayor's office. His victim's name was Giuseppe Belviso, an Italian laborer, and the man was a stranger to him, and there had been no reason for the murder. He started to serve his sentence in 1907. Originally, he was to be executed, but then it was commuted to life imprisonment. The warden and others thought he was pretending insanity. However, they realized he was not in his right mind. He kept insisting that he wanted to be hanged, and that he owned coal mines. According to Brubaker, the world was in his power, and his life could be found written in the last chapter of Revelations in the Bible. He said people would get in through the bars and visit him in his cell, where they would take blankets off him while he slept. Prior to his incarceration, he had worked as a timekeeper and as a brakeman for the Pennsylvania Railroad. He admitted to killing the man without knowing who he was, driven by an irresistible force, and that God compelled him to commit murder. He was transferred to a lunatic asylum. However, he was not long for this world, since he died in July 1911 at the age of 29. No doubt there were many that ended up in prison who in reality were truly insane. In 1923, Warden Robert J. McKenty was forced to resign after it was revealed that he had set up a committee of convicts which included 4 of the most desperate inmates to run it. These prisoners were known as the 4 Horsemen by the other prisoners. The conditions had become so desperate at the prison that 30 of the worst inmates, including the Horsemen, were moved to Western Penitentiary at Pittsburgh in the aftermath of the investigation. The report came from J. Washington Logue, a member of the Board of Prison Inspectors. He noted in March 1923 when several prisoners assaulted 2 guards. This report is what brought him to the prison to begin with. This is when he found that a number of inmates dictated the policy inside the prison. It was believed the prisoners were involved in the distribution of narcotic drugs. Other prisoners were in fear of their lives and afraid to leave their cells. There were reports of small stills found in the cells and convicts playing dice in the prison yard. Explosives were found in one of the cells. The cells the Horsemen occupied were so favored they were known as Rich Row and Millionaire's Colony. Warden McKenty was known among prison social workers as being sympathetic with humanitarian ideas in running the prison. One of his mottos was, "No man can be a man unless you make him believe in himself." His idealism turned out to be disastrous. In July 1923, Leo Callahan, a.k.a. James Malone, prisoner C-566, and 5 accomplices escaped from Eastern State Penitentiary. All the men were in prison for serious crimes such as murder and attempted murder. The inmates used the ladder they had made in the prison carpenter shop. They overpowered 2 guards and another convict, then climbed to the top of the wall and lowered themselves to the street with ropes, some of which had been made of their bed sheets, and others stolen from the penitentiary supplies. Outside, they took a truck, and 10 blocks away they held up Thomas McAllister, an auto salesman, stealing his touring car and forcing him to be the driver. They abandoned the car in the woods near Elkton, Maryland, and left the man bound and gagged. A few days later, a motorboat docked along Pocomoke Sound near the entrance to Chesapeake Bay was stolen by 4 men believed to be the convicts. A young woman well known to the police as, quote, an associate of gunmen, highwaymen, and other underworld characters, end quote, was sought by the police as the person who gave outside aid to the convicts, since she had visited one of the prisoners several times before the escape. Callahan was one of 4 men who escaped Eastern State Pen and was never recaptured. All of his accomplices were eventually apprehended, including one who made it as far as Honolulu, Hawaii. Callahan was the last one to evade capture forever, but not the first. In 1838, Bernard Tease was doing a 3-year stretch for horse theft. On August 27, 1838, with 1 year left to complete his sentence, he found a way to open his cell door and scale the prison wall. He was never recaptured. His father's will, written in 1843, suggested his family members never saw him again. On November 1859, Patrick Lafferty was indicted for the murder of John Reed and found guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. He had stabbed a 60-year-old man 7 times because the man refused to give him a ride in his wagon. He was sentenced to solitary confinement at hard labor for 12 years. In 1866, Lafferty, quote, dressed himself in a suit of clothes belonging to a prisoner, going out on expiration of sentence, and was permitted by said officer Keynes to pass out, end quote. A search throughout the city for the prisoner did not find him, and he was never recaptured. Timothy Boyle was indicted in the murder of James David Story, a saloon keeper, in 1873. He was convicted to 12 years in 1875 on a charge of 2nd-degree murder. On New Year's Eve, 1877, with the help of 2 bakery workers, he hid himself in a hogshead cask filled with garbage loaded on a wagon heading out of the prison. The cask was supposedly emptied at the city trash dump, but by then Boyle was gone. Patrick Norris, a.k.a. Conley Houston, and James Curran, who was being sought for the Story murder as well, had escaped until 1880, when he was arrested in Kentucky on a separate charge of assault and battery. He was identified as a fugitive, and also a Molly Maguire, an Irish secret society, which were active among the coal miners in Pennsylvania. Their activities were often violent. In March 1881, there were no witnesses to positively identify Norris as one Conley Houston, who had participated in the murder of David Story, so he was released by the judge. It was noted that Boyle had not been recaptured, and rumor was he had fled to Europe. He was never found. A mess hall was built in 1924, and for the first time, prisoners ate together. This was the same year Governor Pinchot sentenced Pep, an actual dog, to a life sentence at the prison, supposedly after the dog killed his wife's cat. Pep was assigned inmate number C2559. Later, some believe the governor donated his own dog to the prison under the pretense of the cat's murder to boost morale. The dog was pardoned in 1929. Some prisoners kept birds and rats as pets. In 1924, radios were confiscated after it was found they were used to smuggle narcotics into the prison. A visitor who had been repairing a convict's set in a cell when he received a radio message in code detailing a scheme to bring narcotics into the penitentiary in a rubber ball thrown over the wall. Investigations showed the message came from a small portable set near the prison. After radios were banned, prisoners constructed ones that were so small they could fit in the palm of the hand. They used bed springs for aerial connections with water pipes or steam pipes in the prison for grounds. Prison officials even found one hidden in a Bible. After all the radios were removed, less prisoners showed signs of being under the influence of drugs. Al Capone spent 8 months at Eastern State Pen, starting in 1929, after he was convicted of carrying a concealed .38 caliber revolver outside a movie theater. His cell, located on cell block 12, cell 181, was luxuriously furnished with a desk, chair, oriental carpet, private bathroom, and running water. Despite the ease of his stay at ESP, Capone was said to be tormented by the ghost of James Clark, one of the victims of the St. Valentine's Day murder, which he had ordered. Other prisoners would hear him beg Jimmy to leave him alone. It was said that even after he left the prison, the ghost continued to torment him. By then, Capone was suffering from syphilis that eventually would cause his death, so it's not known if this was a true phantom or the product of his illness. In 1938, a habitual offender who found himself behind bars once again was a certain Joseph Joe Buzzard, one of 5 Buzzard brothers who were known as thieves. He had kept the police on the jump since 1895. He was 77 years old when he was convicted of stealing a suitcase containing sample tennis shoes off of the left foot. He got 2 years for his troubles. His mentor had been his brother Abe, known as the best hoss thief in the country, who died in 1935 behind bars at Eastern State Penitentiary. In 1937, Victor Babe Andreoli and Horace Bowers were serving their life imprisonment terms for the murder of State Trooper John J. Browski, committed during a roadhouse holdup. In 1940, Andreoli was one of 10 men found trying to tunnel out of the penitentiary. Dirt was taken from 2 tunnels beginning at cell 50, block 8, and carried in the convict's pocket to the tunnel entrance, where it was dumped into the toilet. Soon after the discovery by the guards, the body of convict James Wilson, 25, was found hanging in his cells by a sheet. On the floor of the originating cells, directly in front of the toilet, concealed underneath a bookcase, they found a hole where a slab of cement flooring had been sliced out. Beneath it was an 18-foot drop. Mining techniques were used to board up the tunnel walls. One of the tunnels originated in Andreoli's cell, but like other prisoners, Andreoli had no plans of spending the rest of his life behind bars. In 1943, he escaped again, probably in one of several trucks that brought supplies into the prison, since he was one of the prisoners given yard freedom while they were being unloaded. He appeared at the home of an acquaintance named Anthony Cella and forced his wife to give him a change of clothing. At this time, Mr. Cella arrived home, and he coerced the man to drive him around by holding a 12-inch knife to the throat of his 6-year-old daughter. After changing clothes, he jumped from the car and shouted, "Tell the cops I'll never be taken alive. The first cop that lays a hand on me dies." Cella then went to the home of John Andreoli, the convict's brother, who said someone had come into his house, ransacked it, and stolen a large sum of money. On November 6, 1943, a week after he escaped, Andreoli was shot in a gunfight in a local eatery known as the Rainbow Grill, where he was eating breakfast. The 27-year-old was dropped by 4 bullets. He fired 2 shots and missed. On April 3, 1945, William Slick Willie Sutton staged a 12-man escape attempt. It was discovered he had dug an undiscovered 90-foot tunnel under the prison. 11 of the 12 prisoners were recaptured, the first being Willie, who only enjoyed 3 minutes of freedom before being returned to his cell. This had been his 5th escape attempt at this prison. One of the prisoners was shot 6 times when he went to a girlfriend's house, who was the daughter of a city policeman. He was in serious condition, and it's not known if he died of his injuries. Once returned to prison, they each had 15 to 30 years terms added to their existing sentences. The 97-foot tunnel had originated in the cell of W. Clarence Kleindienst. However, this was not the first time Slick Willie, aka the actor, tried to get free. In 1936, another escape was being planned through the steam pipe tunnel. Sutton, who was convicted for a bank holdup in 1934, had already escaped from Sing Sing in 1930. Involved in the escape were George H. Wilson, who was serving a term for escaping from Eastern State Penitentiary 2 years before, and George Moore, who was serving 10 to 20 for a bank holdup. A guard found that a grate leading to the tunnel had been tampered with. Inside the tunnel, they found evidence that a chisel was used to access the prison sewer system, which had allowed the escape of 5 prisoners in 1934. This should not have come as a surprise when, during renovations carried out in the 1930s, 30 incomplete inmate-dug tunnels were found. On February 10, 1947, Sutton and other prisoners dressed as prison guards carried 2 ladders across the prison yard to the wall after dark. When the prison's searchlights hit him, Sutton yelled, "It's okay!" and no one stopped him. He was recaptured in 1952 and released in 1969. Before his death, Sutton co-authored I, Willie Sutton, and Where the Money Was. When asked why he robbed banks, Sutton simply replied, "Because that's where the money is." The quote evolved into Sutton's Law, which is often invoked to medical students as a metaphor for emphasizing the most likely diagnosis, rather than wasting time and money investigating every conceivable possibility. Stanley Kowitz was another life story that played out inside the walls of Eastern State Pen. One of 15 children born to William and Mary Kohowitz. In May 1945, the 21-year-old, who was a suspect in 5 burglaries, surrendered to his parish priest. He had just served 4 years at Huntington Reformatory. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years at Eastern State for the burglary charges. However, his stay was short-lived, since he was stabbed to death 3 months later. It happened while he was standing in line for breakfast. Eugene McQuiston, 19, stabbed him in the back with an 8-inch scissor blade. McQuiston confessed he had killed Colwitz because he had snubbed him and took a poke at me while they were standing in the line. McQuiston died in 1971, and his body was donated to the Kansas City College of Osteopathy Anatomical Department. As the years passed, the prison deteriorated. In 1969, prisoners were forbidden to have toothpicks and chewing gum, since the locks on the cell doors were so frail they could be opened with these items. The prison stood abandoned until the late 1980s, where trees were growing out of the cells and it had become a breeding ground for feral cats. The animals were captured and neutered until the population died out. The prison opened for tours in 1994 after renovations. It was estimated that 75,000 prisoners had spent time inside its walls since 1829. Now the storied facility stands in ruins. Cell blocks, once the only walls the prisoners would see for most of their days incarcerated, are now crumbling and reduced to dusty piles. Ironically, one of the phantoms said to haunt Eastern State Penitentiary is not a prisoner, but probably a guard, since the shadowy figure is seen in the guard tower. Disembodied voices, laughter, and crying is heard throughout the prison, as well as flitting shadow figures. However, there are spots where it's more pronounced. One is cell block 4, where the locksmith during the 1990s felt a presence staring at him intensely. Others on the staff have had a similar experience. It was on the catwalk of cell block 4 where the show Ghost Hunters captured a short video of a shadowy figure. Amy Holloman, creative director at the Penitentiary's Haunted House attraction for 13 years, had her own paranormal experience during the first season it was open. On Mischief Night, October 30th, she was one of 2 people left on the premises. She described her experience this way, quote, "All of a sudden, in the back area of the room where we were in, we started to hear these sounds, like a person was stamping something and then moving a paper over repeatedly. Then we heard the sound of a cup move. These were independent sounds that lasted for 15 seconds. It doesn't seem like that long of a time, but imagine if something is terrifying you. It's pretty long. I literally learned what the word petrified meant. I was frozen stiff." End quote. Holloman had an actor who worked on the site tell her one day, "Amy, I can't work on the top floor of cell block 12 anymore. Can you move my spot?" When she asked why, he replied, "There's a ghost up there. When I was at the edge of the cell block, it looked like this woman was running towards me screaming, and once she got close to me, she turned around and ran back." She switched the spot. However, this would not be the last time she heard about the notorious cell block 12. 3 years later, another actor came to her with the same story about the second story of the cell block. He said, "You'll never believe this, but I think it was a banshee. It was flying down the cell block towards me screaming, and then turned back." In 2016, she had a visitor mail back a bolt they had taken from the site. A letter described where they regretted taking it because they had the worst luck since then. The sender, who didn't include their name, packaged the item with a bag of sage and asked for it to be placed back exactly where it was found. Director James Travis also had his own eerie encounters. One night he noticed a large steel panel that had been delivered for him at the gatehouse, and he decided to take it to cell block 12. This is how he described the incident, quote, "It was close to midnight on a rainy and windy Friday during the fall of the year 2012. There was an event that evening and all the other guests and staff had left the property. I planned to put the steel panel just inside of the gate there. The dolly kept sliding out of the way, so I had to use both hands to get the gate unlocked. He felt someone behind him. I knew that everyone else had left the property, so my first suspicion was that some miscreant had secluded themselves away and were up to no good. I turned around and there was a short man, only about 5 feet 4 inches, standing a few feet away from me. I instantly drew back, my fist ready to strike, heart pumping. Then I realized he was translucent and dressed in Civil War era military clothes. Then he disappeared." Later, Travis was reminded the Eastern State Penitentiary was operating during the Civil War. Another staff member, who had worked for 14 seasons at the attraction, described where his head throbbed and he felt cold and queasy while standing in 3 locations. They were the warden's office, the very back section of the Klondike cells, and near a pipe closet on the 2nd floor of death row. Who these phantoms are will possibly never be answered, but in truth, it's a cast of thousands. What do you think about that? Yeah, I'm sure there's stories that are known, and then there's other stories that are not known. Okay, the last story is out of Gizmodo, and it's titled "The Story of America's Oldest Tombstone is Surprisingly Complicated." It seems like a particularly tough Jeopardy question. Where did the oldest tombstone in America come from? Despite being over 400 years old, there hasn't been a conclusive answer, making the Black Limestone Monument something of a mystery until now. The tombstone, often considered the oldest in the United States, was found in Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. While historians have a decent handle on who it belonged to, how it got there has remained somewhat of a mystery. Early settlers had no experience in carving tombstones. Determining its origins offers not just a deeper understanding of colonial America, but also helps researchers better grasp the era's trade routes. The stone was originally laid in the floor of Jamestown's church, built in 1617. Sometime in the 1640s, it was moved as the church was expanded. Over the next 250 or so years, the tombstone was forgotten until it was discovered and repaired in 1901. In 1906, it was moved to the historical colony, then New Memorial Church. The outline of a person wearing armor and the presence of what likely is a shield and sword in the decorative design suggests the tombstone was constructed in honor of a knight. The identity of said knight remains somewhat in dispute. While Jamestown's first resident governor, Sir Thomas West, who died in 1618 while on a ship to the colony, was a knight, the geologists note that there are no historical record tying the stone to him. There's more evidence connecting it to Sir George Yearley, a colonial governor and one of the earliest slave owners in American history. A possible reference was found in the will of Yearley's step-grandson, asking that his own tombstone have the same inscription as the one on the broken tomb. Whether it's West or Yearley, what's clear is that the stone was meant for someone of means. Engraved tombstones in 17th century Virginia were a status symbol for affluent colonists, but there are no rocks like this near Jamestown, meaning they must have imported from somewhere. To figure out that point of origin, Marcus Key, a geophysicist at Dickinson College, had to think very, very small. He looked at microfossils embedded in the limestone. The ensuing study, published in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology, Key noted that fossils are often more unique to a time and space than chemical composition due to the evolutionary process. Limestone is also a great medium for preserving fossils, as it is resistant to heat and pressure. Key cut thin slivers of preserved fragments of the tombstone and found several microfossils of single-cell organism called foraminiferans. Okay, there you go. The ages of the organisms varied. Some went as far back as the Mississippian epoch, almost 360 million years ago. Several of the species were endemic to a single area of Europe, which included parts of England, Ireland, and Belgium. These species did not co-occur anywhere in North America. Key wrote in the study, Knight's tombstone had to be imported from Europe. Historical evidence of similar colonial tombstones around the Chesapeake Bay suggests the source was Belgium. Key observed that black faux marble tombstones were all the rage in England at the time of the Jamestown colony, and prominent residents would have been eager to get in line with the hippest burial trends. He concluded that the stone likely was found in Belgium, shipped to London, where it was carved, and had now lost brass inlays installed. Then it was loaded onto a ship and sent to the New World. That must have cost a pretty penny, despite conditions in Jamestown that could be brutal. There's some evidence that things could get so bad the colonists had to resort to cannibalism. Even so, some right knight decided to shell out some big bucks to import a memorial to himself. Rich people problems, am I right? That's cute. Yeah, you know what? And I found that all the time. I want to say till maybe less than the last 50 years. and even as you go back, where you were buried, the cemetery, all these things, people thought about these things. They worried, not worried, but they set up mausoleums. I mean, also depending again, how deep were their pockets, mausoleums, family plots, obelisks, certain, even certain cemeteries were more affluent. That's where you wanted to be. Even to the point of what they were saying, it wasn't just put a memorial there. I want the modern, the trendy thing. And of course, this also led to why, if you were a criminal, suicide in some cases, or you were on the fringes of society and you did something bad, the ultimate punishment for the daily part was you weren't allowed to get buried inside the cemetery. In other words, people took this very seriously. It reflected on yourself, it reflected on your family, it reflected on your standing in the community, whatever it was. So yeah, I believe that whoever this was probably did spend some big bucks to get themselves, so when people would go to the cemetery, go, oh, that kind of deal. Anyway, guys, I hope you like this latest set of eerie news, and I will be back very soon with some more. Till then.